Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and I do want to pick up where my colleague Phil Twyford left off, looking at what is the clause 4 of this bill, inserting the new section 2A. And I think the title of that new clause gives away the game completely. Its minister may exclusively administer land declared subject to this section. So what has previously been under the control of the Housing New Zealand Board, previously the Housing Corporation after that, the decisions about the way in which Housing New Zealand will control the land and the houses that it uses, gone by the stroke of a pen into the hands of 2 ministers. The party opposite that would tell us it's the great party of democracy, the great party of small government. I think that's probably what Todd Muller and Matt Ducey thought they signed up to with the National Party. They don't like big government, don't like the control of big government. They're signing up to it right here. They've got a charter here where 2 ministers take control of what happens with Housing New Zealand, take on the legacy that goes back to the first Labor government and tear it apart and say that it doesn't matter anymore, that the state should have that role. The idea, the social contract that New Zealanders have bought into for generations, that if you cannot afford to house you and your family yourself, that the state will be there to step in. That's because it's fundamental, Mr Chair. Because it's fundamental to the well-being of New Zealanders, to the well-being of New Zealand children, that they grow up in a warm, dry, safe home. That they have that as the basis of going on to be able to achieve their goals and dreams in their life. That's been there for generations. And along come the national government and say, we're not so sure about that. We want to open it up for private provision. Now, as Phil Twyford's already mentioned, this policy that's enabled here in part 1 of this bill has been dressed up by the national government has been about making sure that we improve the quality of provision of social housing in New Zealand. And the Labor Party is very proud of having worked with the community sector to build up social housing. But that's about building up social housing. That's about increasing the stock of social housing. It's not about transferring something built up by generations of taxpayers and flicking it off to private investors. And members on the opposite side of the House didn't seem to like it when Phil Twyford suggested this. Well, I suggest they take a look at what the Minister of Finance, Bill English, said only this week. I quote here from the news story, fully private share market listed companies could provide social housing in return for guaranteed subsidies within 5 years, Bill English has told fund managers. So this policy that started out being about the community sector and getting people who were more appropriate than the government to provide social housing has morphed over a year or so into flicking it off to private developers. That's right. The whole point of the state housing system in New Zealand has been because of the market failure in the private sector. Because the private sector is not interested in providing that base level of housing that's required to give opportunity to all New Zealanders. So in part 1 of this bill, the response, that whole ethos, that whole fabric that's been knitted together in New Zealand is torn apart by Section 2A. Section 2A1, the Minister may, after notifying the Corporation and by notice in the Gazette, declare any state housing land or class of state housing land, including any dwellings, other buildings and chattels on that land, to be land that is subject to this section. Anything. Anything at all in the hands of 2 ministers. And I defy any member opposite to get up and justify why ministers are being put above the law, because that's what's happening here. The law's being changed to make sure ministers can do as they wish here. That's right. Why have a Housing New Zealand board? Just get rid of them. Just leave it to the ministers. Why even have the pretense any longer that there is any form of process here? And members of all the opposition parties in their minority report state very, very clearly that the mandate that's been given here is unwise, and they talk about the unfettered powers to negotiate the transfer of such valuable assets out of the public realm into the private. Mr. Chair,
Robertson.
it is unfettered, Mr. Chair, because that section I've just read out to you, 2A1, gives carte blanche to the minister. Section 2A12, the effect of a declaration is that the minister, to the exclusion of the corporation, has and may perform and exercise the functions and powers of the duty of the corporation under this Act. Just think about that for a minute. That's a specific clause in a bill that says to ministers, you can exclude the Housing Corporation, you can exclude any pretence that you have to abide by the law, and you can go forth and negotiate. Well, we know how great this government is as a negotiator. Fantastic work. Yeah, we'll get Stephen Joyce involved. He can learn the lessons of Sky City, of Rio Tinto, Warner Brothers, all the great negotiations that this government over there has done.
TPP.
And they've hoisted themselves by their own petard here, because every private developer now knows the government's so desperate to get this policy enacted, it's failed to get the community housing sector to buy in, that they are now beholden to someone to come along and rescue their privatisation agenda. Well, Mr. Speaker, that is a travesty. This is part of New Zealand's history. It's part of the social contract that New Zealanders have for generations said, we want there to be this kind of housing stock, and this government has come along and given carte blanche to ministers under Part 1 of this. The only thing I will say is that under Clause 2A, what was 5, the corporation's not responsible or liable for the minister's performance or exercise of functions or powers or duties. Well, they'll be pleased about that, won't they? Because they won't have to put up with yet another negotiation stuff-up by the National Party. But let's be absolutely clear. I haven't seen a clause like the new Section 2A in the time I've been in Parliament. A clause that so obviously goes out of its way to undermine the accountability and transparency arrangements that we would expect from our public service. Is it little wonder that we're plummeting down the Transparency International ratings under this government? And we had Transparency International specifically mention the Sky City deal when they were talking about why New Zealand went down, and the Saudi sheep deal. Well, I'd add this too, Mr. Chair. I'd add what's in Part 1 of this bill, because it is an unbelievable power grab by this government. The government and the party that would tell us that they're all about democracy and they're all about small government, what they're about is centralising power. This is actually one of the great centralising governments of all time. The people who said we're going to make sure that we get services to the front line in public services, and they ended up slashing public services in the provinces. It's the same thing here. It's a power grab, Mr. Chair. But much more than that, what Part 1 of this bill does is undermine the legacy of state housing in New Zealand. State housing in New Zealand is something that's given numerous New Zealanders the start in life that they would want. And the Prime Minister has been very proud, and so he should be, to stand up and say, I came from a situation where social housing helped me. Good on him. Why is that not on offer to everybody else? Why is the opportunity to fulfil their hopes and dreams, just as the Prime Minister was able to do, being taken away because of an ideological obsession of Bill English and Paula Bennett that the state should not be involved in housing? The fact of the matter is, for all its imperfections, state housing in New Zealand has delivered opportunity to generations of New Zealanders, and this government wants to come along, as it does so often, and pull the ladder up behind it and say that other people don't get that. And mark my words, Mr. Chair, this is only the beginning of this agenda as Bill English wants to see it. Because the social housing sector, the community housing sector, is desperate to help out, but they don't just want to be lumped with the government's stock. They want to work with the government to get the kind of state housing stock, social housing stock, that New Zealanders need. But instead, because the community sector has said no, the government's gone off and said, all right, we'll sell it off to the highest bidder, we'll get the private sector involved. We know the imperatives are different there. We see that in the private rental market. The people, and every member in this House knows, those in their constituencies who are in social housing are there because the private market has failed them, and they can't be part of that. By turning this over, by giving this power to the ministers to implement their ideological agenda, Mr Chair, where New Zealanders are being failed by this government.